In this series of videos, I'll provide students with suggestions for improving their case debating in the 2AC. If you're struggling to effectively and efficiently respond to case arguments, or if you're doing okay, but you want to take your 2AC case debating to another level, this series aims to give you some actionable advice. Subsequent videos will provide specific tips about signposting, argumentation, efficiency, and how to practice. This video will focus on strategy. You've probably heard many times that the case is the affirmative's offense, but its importance and how the F should best use it differs greatly from debate to debate. In this series, I'll offer general tips that should be helpful in any situation. However, the best 2AC on the case will differ significantly from debate to debate. You should therefore treat the advice offered in these videos as typical best practices, not universal rules. If you follow my advice, you'll eventually get to a place where you can intentionally and thoughtfully deviate from it. To help you get there, I'll explain how to think strategically about 2AC case debating. When debating the case in the 2AC, strategy determines what you need to say and how much you need to say. By strategy, I mean your blueprint for how you'll win the debate. That's your goal. Whether you effectively debated the case in the 2AC is ultimately judged by whether your debating helped improve your chances of winning the debate. The two basic questions you need to answer when thinking about what to do with the case in the 2AC are 1. What do I need to say? And 2. How much do I need to say? In some ways, the second question is redundant. If you need to say something, you just need to say it. What it takes for you to say it is how much you need to say. But in debate, there are different degrees of saying something, from the bare minimum necessary to convey an argument to the fully developed version that fills in most of the details. To figure out what you need to say and how much you need to say it, think strategically. What will help you win? What you need to say and how much you need to say depends on two primary questions. What is the most likely to NR, and what is the most threatening to NR? Many times these are the same things, but sometimes they're different. You can rarely be 100% certain about the 2NR, but you can typically identify the one or two most likely options based on the team's tendencies, the 1NC, and your read of the initial cross-examinations. This might affect your choice of which advantage to emphasize, whether to read additional case evidence, how to extend the case impacts, and whether to read an add-on advantage. Here are 4 examples. First, if the negative is likely to defend the status quo, you need one strong advantage to weigh against and beat their disadvantage. If one of your advantages is better against the status quo, you might choose to emphasize it. If that advantage has a missing internal link in the 1AC that doesn't matter against counterplans, but does matter if the neg draws attention to it, you might need to read a backline card. If the impact you want to go for can turn the DA impact, you might want to say that, or even read a card to support it. Second, if the neg is likely to go for a counterplan, you need one strong solvency deficit to beat that counterplan. If one of your advantages is better against the counterplan you expect the negative to go for, you might choose to emphasize it. If the internal link and solvency for that advantage will be further developed in your counterplan frontline, you might choose to thoroughly extend and explain the impact part of the advantage to avoid duplication. If another advantage is very weak against the counterplan, you might choose to entirely abandon it, perhaps in favor of reading an additional add-on advantage against the counterplan. If the advantage you want to go for against the counterplan can be further expanded, you might choose to do that as well, perhaps by reading an impact add-on or an additional internal link. Third, if the negative is likely to go for a critique, your case becomes an answer to the critique, a net benefit to the permutation, a response to serial policy failure, an example of your framework argument, an impact turn to the alternative, or something else. Exactly what you need will depend on the specific critique, but you'll often need to more fully develop unfinished 1AC advantages. If important 1AC evidence is rhetorically powerful but weakly supported, you might choose to read more detailed backline evidence. Instead of just extending your impact, you might choose to frame it differently, perhaps by reading an additional impact card, a card that defends the underlying assumptions of your impact, or a response to a K-link about your impact. While you might sometimes choose to do this on the critique rather than the case, the important part is to make sure your extension of the case meets the requirements of your planned 2AR ballot against the critique. Fourth, if the negative is likely to go for an impact turn, you need to treat it like a featured negative disadvantage. This might cause you to choose to read several backline cards on the impact turned advantage, way more than you would in other situations. It might cause you to change how you use the other advantage, or influence whether and which add-on advantage to introduce. How much you need to say largely flows from the same considerations you'll use to determine what you need to say, but there are other factors you'll also need to consider. I'll share a few examples. First, the likelihood versus the possibility of different 2NR options. Some strategic decisions are more context independent. Regardless of the opponent's tendencies, for example, your AF might require you to fill in relatively more or less about your case. There might be particular negative strategies that create significant enough vulnerabilities that you always or almost always need to account for them if they're in the 1NC, even if you strongly suspect that the 2NR will go for something else. This might require you to temper your reaction to the likely 2NR option so that you're able to hedge more against another possible 2NR option. This is always a balancing act. Second, the size, meaning the breadth and depth of the 1NC. How to answer big 1NCs is beyond the scope of this video, but what you wish you could say and what you actually have time to say are rarely the same. Against a bigger 1NC, you might need to do more strategic hedging. You might also need to be more brief on the case, deciding that the marginal cost of more brevity on the case is outweighed by the marginal benefit of less brevity on the off-case arguments. Against a smaller 1NC, or one where you have more certainty about the likely 2NR, you might decide the opposite. Third, the quality of your 1AC cards. I mean both the quality of the individual cards and the quality of the story you construct with them. The better the 1AC, the less likely you'll need to read backline cards, and the more you can get away with being a little bit more brief. The weaker the 1AC, the more you'll need to compensate. And this isn't always just the difference between a good AF and a bad AF, although it often is. Sometimes a good affirmative will have relatively weak 1AC evidence, but it's good because of the strategic benefits it gives the AF against off-case positions. If this describes your case, you'll need to adjust your 2AC case debating accordingly by increasing your coverage of the case. Fourth and finally, how much you trust the 1AR. By trust, I don't just mean whether you think the 1AR is good enough to debate the case well. Rather, I mean whether you think your choices when debating the case in the 2AC are putting the 1AR into a strong enough strategic position against the various potential 2NR options. In some situations, you might be comfortable with taking a bigger risk because you don't think the negative will choose the option that you're leaving the 1AR vulnerable to. In other situations, you'll want to be more careful. The role of the 1AR is worth considering separately. Good 2ACs almost always result in significant 1AR responsibilities, but those responsibilities are known in advance, well prepared, and achievable within the likely time constraints. As it relates to debating the case, the negatives arguments are almost never well developed in the 1NC. Good negative teams will significantly deepen them in the 2NC and 1NR. A good 2AC on the case can put the AF in a good position to withstand this negative approach, but that's never enough. The 1AR needs to be prepared to defend the case, especially against a very strong and mostly new negative block. When thinking about how to debate the case in the 2AC, you should be thinking about how to debate the case in the 1AR. Sometimes a marginal improvement in the 2AC sets up the 1AR to be marginally worse. If the negative opts for a block strategy that results in this not mattering, it's a net positive for the affirmative. But it's a calculated gamble that might wind up being counterproductive if the negative recognizes and exploits it. Ultimately, this is why debating the case in the 2AC is difficult. You have to be smart, and you have to be willing to take some risks. The point in all of these examples is that you should debate the case with the negative strategy in mind. In some situations, the case is your answer to a counterplan. In others, it's what you'll weigh against the disadvantage. And in others, it's part of your answer to a critique. Regardless, it's always part of your overall strategy, and never a separate, siloed part of the debate. What you need to say depends on how you're going to defeat the negative strategy. If you start to debate the case with this in mind, you'll quickly become more capable of making the right judgments about what and how much you need to say. In this video, I've explained the strategy of 2AC case debating. Instead of thinking about the case as a standalone issue, I've suggested that it be considered within the larger strategic context of the debate. This, in turn, helps students figure out what they need to say and how much they need to say on the case in the 2AC. With this foundation established, subsequent videos will move on to address some specific issues related to 2AC case debating, including signposting, argumentation, efficiency, and how to practice. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you for watching.